It's time for another round of questions and reflections. Let's start with the chapter Our Own Time. What tactic does Sophie attempt in order to keep Albert Nag distracted as Alberto requested? What is the significance of what Morten the Goose tells her? Morten the Goose, by the way, if you didn't get a sense, is from this older Norwegian fairy tale that before reading this book I had no idea about, and was made later into a television show, a kids cartoon television show even.
Mills, come on, Mills, come on up.
Oh, come on up, Mills, 旅に出かけよう。準備なんかいらない。
But the concept and gist is that Nils Holgersson, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is transported, is shrunk to size and transported by this goose all over the country in order to learn something more about its history. I won't go into the details, I guess, but that conversation that they have that Sophie has with the goose is actually fairly important, and that takes place between 4:49 is when she first tries to distract Albert, and she does we assume a decent job because we're not told anything about Alberto during this period, so we know that Hilda's father must be to some degree distracted. She's pleased with it. And then on page 450 towards the bottom, the goose is still talking with Sophie and says, "That's interesting. I presume this is a philosophy book, then. When I was flying over Sweden with Nils Holgersson, we touched down on," again, I'm going to butcher some pronunciations here, forgive me, Marbacka in Värmland, where Nils met an old woman who was planning to write a book about Sweden for school children. It was to be both instructive and true, she said. When she heard about Nils' adventures, she decided to write a book about all the things he had seen on Gooseback. That was very strange. To tell you the truth, it was rather ironic because we were already in that book. Blaring irony in itself to be talking about this book that talks about the irony of being in the book that was written of one, and then to be in a book that is written of the characters who are they're talking about themselves in the book. Obviously, it's irony piled on irony. Just everything that we've seen up to this point, but just more blatantly so. But also, in a sense, almost a key point of motivation. On page 451, the goose returns, "Oh well, it's all the same. If it had been up to me, I would have liked to fly you through the whole history of philosophy, just as I flew Nils Holgersson through Sweden. We could have circled over Miletus and Athens, Jerusalem and Alexandria, Rome and Florence, London and Paris, Jena and Heidelberg, Berlin and Copenhagen." And this is exactly what, not the goose, but Gaarder has done with this book. So Gaarder has been the goose for us. He's even inserted in here the very, as it were, method and motivation for what he has done in the book on these couple of pages. So on the one hand, Sophie is, of course, trying to distract Albert Nag by making a big to-do and doing all these crazy things and yodeling for the first time ever. Doesn't know where she learned to yodel. Doesn't matter. Mere bagatelle again. And that is more or less working because in order to do those things, Albert/Gaarder has to actually write her doing those things and can't dedicate any time to what Alberto is up to without, or otherwise we'd hear of it. So in a way, it's this very fun, surreal strategy, just to dwell back on the surrealist for a second, surreal strategy of writing as being the distraction for the person who's writing the distraction, in the same way that we are being introduced to this book of philosophy by this figurative goose who is actually Gaarder/Albert Nag/whomever. Okay, next, why does Alberto purposefully arrive late to his cafe meeting with Sophie? And what does he hope she learns from this? encounter there from his being late. We can see this on page 459, a couple of pages down the road. And he says, our own lives influence the way we perceive things. Keep in mind, he's talking about Sartre's work. So the way we perceive things in the room. If something is of no interest to me, I don't see it. So now I can perhaps explain why I was late today. It was on purpose, right? Tell me first of all what you saw when you came in here. The first thing I saw was that you weren't here. Isn't it strange that the first thing you noticed was something that was absent? Maybe, but it was you I was supposed to meet. Sartre uses just such a cafe visit to demonstrate the way we annihilate whatever is irrelevant for us. And so obviously he's done this to demonstrate to her this interesting aspect of our lives that we tend to not account for in more sort of traditional subject-object ways of thinking about the world that was characteristic of modern philosophy. Through Sartre, and as you could tell in the in-depth lecture, I would actually attribute it even further to Heidegger. What's interesting is what would appear to be absent to us, or everything that is, as it were, around us is not necessarily the focal point of our attention, but rather it is the doing of things. See, for Heidegger, it was Zuhandenheit versus Vorhandenheit. It was this difference between what's called ready to hand and present at hand. When you're using something, when you're using a computer, or you're watching this video, you're probably completely focused on whatever this object, not the object, but the object of the work, the goal is. That is, you're focused on this doing of something, and you're probably not really noticing the fact that you're watching it on a screen, except now I've pointed it out, so now you are, or that you're having to sit on a chair, so whatever that chair or feels like on your butt, or if you're standing up, the floor on your feet, you don't notice those things until they're brought to your attention by either something breaking down or someone pointing them out to you in some way. So most of what our so-called conscious experience appears to be is of all the things that are not directly a part of our focused awareness, but rather sort of comprise the equipment, to use Heidegger's word, the equipment in the world that surrounds us towards accomplishing this certain activity, in this case, watching this video, or doing your homework, or whatever you're going to do next. So Sartre as well is kind of commenting in this way on the fact that the person would also be, who's of focus, would see in their absence, there's something interesting about how their very absence as a focal point, again, makes it almost dismissive, or to a farther extreme impossible to be present or aware even of what's going on around you. Next, let's see. Name at least 3 20th century movements in philosophy that Alberto describes, and from what thinkers or earlier movement they stem, and I should say each of them stem there, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing when you came across this one. The whole nature in which he comes up with these is, of course, which ones are most important pertaining to Gaarder, just like in the lecture video, which ones that were most important to me were the ones I brought up. But I, just as I'm sure Gaarder tried to do, attempted to give a fair, balanced perspective on that. Nonetheless, let's take a look at 462, 463. It's where he talks about them, and I'm not going to bring up any, actually, because I think there are several of them, and I don't think that you really need me to go through and say them all, and hopefully you brought up a couple yourself. But for instance, if you dwelled on 462 on the current of Neo-Thomism, you were able to recognize that stems from Thomas Aquinas and is therefore also highly influenced by his, sort of fixation on Aristotle's work applied to Christianity. If you were focused instead on Neo-Darwinism, that's all. A lot of these neos, right, tells you exactly what it stems from in part. Psychoanalysis from the works of Freud, naturally. And materialism, as you know, dates all the way back to the work of the pre-Socratics, as far back as, that is, Thales and Anaximander and others. So hopefully you had no problems dealing with this particular question. Another interesting one that I chose not to bring up during the lecture, the in-depth lecture, was eco-philosophy, also known as ecosophy. That is a whole thing in its own right. Arne Ness also was someone I was avidly reading at one point in my life, and just simply don't have as much time as I would otherwise dedicate to it to talk about it. But hopefully you caught that this was one of the few streams that seems to also wish to step outside of the quote-unquote westernized tradition of philosophy in order to tap into maybe individual collective wisdoms that are located throughout different civilizations and cultures, which of course poses the problem then that maybe Western philosophy doesn't do that, and that's something that I think is actually debatable. Next, what does Alberto warn Sophie about regarding New Age science and claims about the supernatural? And that will be, let's start on 464, the very next page. This is actually going to be a bit of an intensive answer, but I hope that you garnered at least a couple of these from Gaarder as you were attempting to answer this question, because it's actually, Gaarder provides a lot of really excellent critical points in regards to New Ageism, and then short commentary after that. But on page 464, right in the middle, Alberto says, I think you will find that much of what marches under the New Age banner is humbug. Even the so-called new religion, new occultism, and modern superstitions of all kinds have influenced the Western world in recent decades. It has become an industry. Alternative offers on the philosophical market have mushroomed in the wake of the dwindling support for Christianity. Then if we jump over to page 466, we see inside the store, Alberto pointed to the longest wall. It had 3 sections: New Age, alternative lifestyles, and mysticism. The books that had intriguing titles such as Life After Death, Secrets of Spiritism, etc., etc., etc. There were hundreds of books. Under the shelves, even more books were stacked up. This is also the 20th century Sophie, and we can say part of the 21st as well. This is the temple of our age. You don't believe in any of this stuff? Much of it is humbug, but it sells as well as pornography. A lot of it is a kind of pornography. Young people can come here and purchase the ideas that fascinate them most. But the difference between real philosophy and these books is more or less the same as the difference between real love and pornography. Now, Sophie fights back a little bit, saying, aren't you being rather crass? But we are surveying Gaarder's philosophy in part here. I think we're getting some very genuine sense from Gaarder. Alberto is really not just echoing Albert Nag, but very clearly echoing thoughts, voicing thoughts of Gaarder as much as Nag. But this is just the first of reasons. This is, or the first kind of category or box or pigeonhole that Alberto wants to put New Ageism in. He does want to try and give it credit for being more diverse than, just any one brand or something. So if we go farther down, obviously it would not be very appropriate for a real philosopher to say that they are all equally bad. But I don't mind saying that all these subjects together possibly chart a fairly detailed map of a landscape that does not exist. And there are many figments of the imagination here that Hume would have committed to the flames. Many of those books do not contain so much as one iota of genuine experience. Now, my only one small point of pushback here is that New Ageism, as much as I discredit it as well, has perhaps in one small side benefit opened up to a lot more people interesting aspects of mythology that otherwise might have continued to also just be awash with counterfactualism and so forth. This is nonsense, or this is just, it might be interesting in its own right, but we don't have the time to look into this stuff. Mythology is incredibly interesting and even resourceful as far as both aesthetic and ethical nuances are concerned, and I really don't think we should ignore those. So that said, maybe the landscape that it paints of a metaphysical nature is completely off the mark. As Gaarder says, we have to wonder if there aren't, at least in the inklings of mythology that one can trace New Ageism back to, if it at least introduces you or more people to those mythologies, perhaps then we are at least getting led back to a place where some very interesting and worthy aesthetic and ethical aspects of human culture are being surmised there. However, that is only one category, like I said. So what are the other pigeonholes here? For the second one, on page 467, he goes on to say, mysterious coincidences, says Sophie, something along those lines. It would be a coincidence anyway. The point is, people collect coincidences like these. Talking about, like, you know, the numbers that you can see. You know, you see a particular number, now it's everywhere. 333 is mine, for the record. I feel like I can spot it everywhere. And yet, we collect these coincidences, and they collect strange or inexplicable experiences. And with such experiences taken from the lives of billions of people are assembled into books, it begins to look like genuine data. And the amount of it increases all the time. But once again, we are looking at a lottery in which only the winning numbers are visible. So this is another important one. On page 468, we get the third category that Gaarder wishes to give us for New Age thinking. Freud showed that we can often serve as mediums for our own unconscious. He's referring, of course, to the way that mediums would sometimes summon the dead, things like that, or be to channel, as we sometimes say, to channel the voice of Apollo back in the days of ancient Greece, but nowadays, like, channel the dead or spirits or the voices of the trees, whatever have you. So Freud showed that we often serve as mediums for our own unconscious. We might suddenly find ourselves thinking or doing something without really knowing why. The reason is that we have a whole lot of experiences, thoughts, and memories inside of us that we are not aware of. Skipping down a ways and going to 469, a lot of curious everyday happenings can be explained by Freud's theory of the unconscious. Skipping some more. So it's either humbug or the winning number effect, or else it's the unconscious, right? Says Sophie. Well, in any case, it's healthier to approach such books with a decent portion of skepticism. So we can almost think of this as almost a fourth miscellaneous category. So once you apply skepticism, you can find that perhaps all New Age thinking, according to Gaarder, falls into one of these three categories: the nonsense, the coincidental, or the unconscious, and just not being aware of what we're unconscious of. Naturally, we can't be aware of what the actual connection is between my thinking of my friend and them calling me the very second, a few seconds after I've thought of them. Then there's this, just if you apply this healthy skepticism, he's saying, then anything that doesn't fall into these other these categories will probably nonetheless prove to be something else along the way that we just have yet to categorize, perhaps. And now we'll move on to the garden party. This is where we learn Sophie's mother's name. But what is Helen's reaction to the or would it be Helen or Helene? Her reaction to the copy of Sophie's World she begins to read to Sophie. In what ways does it relate to our first impression of her in the beginning of the book? That part comes up on 472 through 473. At the very bottom of 472, her mom, who interrogates Sophie about the book, says, "Of course, it's your book. I just want to take a peek at the first page, okay?" Sophie Amundsen was on her way home from school. She had walked the first part of the way with Joanna. They had been discussing robots. Does it really say that? Sophie obviously hasn't read it yet. Yes, it does, Sophie. It's written by someone called Albert Nag. He must be a newcomer. What's your Alberto's name, by the way? Knox. It'll probably turn out this extraordinary person has written a whole book about you, Sophie. It's called a pseudonym. It's not him, Mom. Why don't you just give up? You don't understand anything anyway. No, I don't suppose I do. The garden party is tomorrow. Then everything will be all right again. How flippant. Albert Nag lives in a completely different reality. That's why this book is a white crow. Oh, you really must stop all this. Wasn't it a white rabbit? You stop it. White rabbits, white crows. We're right back at the very beginning of the book where this dynamic between the two of them really hasn't changed. Sophie has learned all this new philosophy, and her mom is more or less at least witnessed from something of a distant perspective, witnessed her throughout this whole journey. While we can say Sophie has legitimately changed in many ways, the relationship she has with her mother quite clearly has not. She still sees that her mother quite willingly so, remains ignorant of these matters and doesn't seem to wish to know more, and instead tries to instruct Sophie about the world on things she doesn't even understand. The point here is that the mom's perspective hasn't changed, and in this sort of one-dimensionality of her character in this book, we don't expect her to change anytime soon. We can expect them to have a loving relationship, but we won't expect her to change in any intellectual way outright. Ultimately, Sophie doesn't have a choice in this book but to move on from her. We may think she has a choice, but in a way, she really doesn't. Not just because Albert Nagg's writing it, but in a way it's because ultimately we all end up having to leave behind not a conservative viewpoint per se, but a viewpoint that doesn't respond to and react and attempt at least to take in all the accumulated wisdom over time, the knowledge and wisdom over time that we have in order to make proper decisions in an ever-evolving world. And so her mother is not changed at all by the fact that this has happened, by the fact that Sophie has a book written about herself, that she may even be a character in the story. It's not changing anything about her. She is stagnant, as is all the other characters, as are all the other characters in the garden party. And so Sophie has really no choice. She has to leave that behind with Alberto in order to move forward. And the last question, what does Alberto share with the guests at the garden party regarding their existence, and how do they respond? This last bit will be on 480 to 481. Midway down, our existence is therefore neither more nor less than a kind of birthday diversion for Hilda Merler-Nag. We have all been invented as a framework for the Major's philosophical education of his daughter. And I won't go through all of this, but I would read those entire 2 pages from our existence to the agitator is attempting to break down all the sound values, so on and so forth, which is the comment that Joanna's father gives in response to Alberto. This is obviously the dynamic that Gaarder wishes to spell out for us between the philosopher and the rest of the intelligent or otherwise world. It doesn't seem to matter whether you have a certain level of intelligence. If you're stuck in that stagnant place that we were just saying Sophie's mom is, then of course it's all going to come off as garbage, and there's only one way to view the world. It's not a great way to approach that world if you wish to see and implement changes. If you, in other words, can't even see the prison, to use another often used cliche, if you can't even see the prison that you're in, how can you ever expect to escape it? And if part of the reason you can't see what prison you're in is because you have been literally created under the conditions that the prison can't be perceived, that you perceive it as nothing more than the world itself, then you could say hope is lost around that. That said, I think it's interesting that Alberto is named by Joanna's father as a communist. He calls him a communist. Obviously, Gaarder wishes to perhaps make a small poke here, that many of the best philosophers later on in this time of history, our time in history, were possibly called communists. I would say that it's not a very fair poke, but I understand it. And certainly, I don't think we need to endorse any of the insults that are thrown at Alberto as some indication of what is or isn't the right perspective to have in the world itself, but rather simply this dichotomy between stagnant being and the desire to become more and advance in thought by those who are willing to explore it by standing on the end of the hairs of the rabbit. Couple of quick things to point out as always, but I find these extremely relevant, and I hope that you do too. Okay, so if we go to page 456 to start, near the top of that page, once again, Gaarder has attempted to point out something that is supposed to, I think, be revelatory for us. Simone de Beauvoir, an existentialist philosopher, and Sophie says, a woman philosopher. That's right. What a relief that humanity is finally becoming civilized. Again, I find this to be antiquated and almost insulting in some sense, particularly given that Gaarder, and we can say legitimately due to probably time and breath constraints here, did not focus on so much of the feminist philosophy that preceded and came after Beauvoir. So I don't think this is in itself inherently a sign of civilization so much as a sign, a wonderful impetus to do more work. But there have been many women philosophers. Of course, we talked about many of those women philosophers. He brought up a couple himself, and to almost make this glaringly, seeming to make it glaringly apparent that Beauvoir is the first major woman philosopher is actually doing a disservice, I think, over a service in the book here. Next, if we go to 462, back where we were talking about those different threads, those different currents of philosophy in the modern day, in the 20th century specifically, we see this excerpt for the materialist section. Again, a lot of current science could be traced back to the efforts of the pre-Socratics. For example, the search for the indivisible elemental particle of which all matter is composed. No one has yet been able to give a satisfactory explanation of what matter is. Modern sciences such as nuclear physics and biochemistry are so fascinated by the problem that for many people it constitutes a vital part of their life's philosophy. I am 100% in agreement with Gaarder on this. This is a little bit of what we were talking about in the in-depth lecture, the over-reductionism and scientific materialism. And what's so interesting is we often just presume that science has the facts and that we can base our philosophies on those facts. But the truth of the matter is that much of what science has garnered for itself, it often started with philosophical meanderings, with philosophy's concepts at heart. We don't know what matter is. In fact, I know of philosophers who have a good reason, who are not idealist, by the way, who say that matter is a ridiculous concept. The idea of matter, starting around the time of Aristotle, perhaps conceived in its best sense by Aristotle as just a sort of filler for something that we don't have a better explanation for. You learn 3 states of matter, but you're never told what matter truly is. This is something that, even if science in many multifaceted ways has attempted to answer by simply providing examples of, it's the same problem as Socrates would throw back at any one of his interlocutors. How can you just give examples of something and not tell me what it is? So we don't have an explanation for matter, and this is one of many things that, again, science has been unable to answer satisfactorily. And it's really healthy and important to be aware of how much science has relied on philosophy for such concepts, but has really, in a way, failed to define for itself in meaningful ways completely. My last note on 474, going back about where we ended before, it's this comment that Sophie's mom makes just at the end of their little conversation at the top of 474. I'll tell you what, Sophie, I don't think I believe in real philosophers any longer. Everything is synthetic nowadays. Isn't that just a great way to end it in that conversation? Truly, how many conversations have you been in? I know that I've been in where, not on the subject of philosophers, but on the subject of anything. Oh, well, everything's synthetic nowadays, so nothing's real, or nothing is natural, nothing is organic, nothing is this, nothing is that. There's these interesting little trickle downs from philosophy that we can find all throughout our everyday existence in many ways that are reminders that a lot of what we take to the bank as being the way the world is often just the way the world was patterned for us by the people who preceded us. Maybe Freud really was right, that what our parents believed so shapes the way that our consciousness and things like the superego develop, that it takes a great amount of effort to overcome some of those paradigms and thought that we are left behind with unless we take up subjects like philosophy and other intellectual endeavors. So with that, we will next time be talking about the final 2 chapters of this book. And as promised, we will discuss very briefly Gaarder's philosophy as well, what I've chosen to call fictional realism. So I will see you then.